the world's GDP, I think, is something like $50 trillion, right? You add up all the productivity of all the countries in the world, put together, I think it's about $50 trillion. And you just say 10% of that will get augmented by AI per year. That's a $5 trillion market. I mean, that's bananas, right? If you ever told me that a company, any company, would get a deal for 20 times their annual sales, right, of any product, I would be like, that is crazy. And then if you said, oh, but they only have 4 years to deliver it, I'd be like, that's nuts. So the real answer is it's not NVIDIA versus AMD at all. You shouldn't think about like one is good and one is bad. So these are all very skilled workers that are not about to get replaced by AI, right? Like we will always need plumbers, electricians, carpenters, general contractors, etc. If Jensen misses by 50%, he's got a $10 trillion company. Oh, the market's still so insanely large. So it's like when you play those games, just cut the number in half. Would you still bet on it? So
yeah, you're a linear machine in an exponential,
in an exponential world. Fantastic.
All right, so today I have Alex from ticker symbol U with me, and he is one of the biggest YouTubers in the AI hardware space and has been for a number of years through a combination of good fortune and wise decisions about things to focus on in his life. He was very well positioned in artificial intelligence, hardware technology here for basically the entire major run-up in excitement around AI hardware that we've seen since ChatGPT and the launch of that and the results that has driven for NVIDIA. And so he's actually made almost 900% returns since ChatGPT launched in December of 2022. And I wanted to get him on today so that we can dive into one of the big hot button topics in AI hardware today, and that is NVIDIA versus AMD. And so I want to turn the first question over to you, Alex. What is the high level overview of NVIDIA versus AMD? Like, what's your 10,000 foot view on these two companies, the market they're going after, and how investors who are thinking about where they want to allocate their money between these two names, like what are the things that they need to be thinking about?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question. And I've gotten this answer wrong so many times, like on my journey to like figure this out myself. So let me give you the 10,000 foot view first, but then we should probably dive into some of the nuance, right? So the real answer is it's not NVIDIA versus AMD at all. You shouldn't think about like one is good and one is bad. So if you're on camp NVIDIA, AMD is not the enemy. If you're in camp AMD, NVIDIA is not the enemy, because the market is growing so fast that there's more than enough room for both of them. They will both be supply limited, not demand limited. And as soon as you're supply limited, you do not care about the competition, right? Because you're not trying to race to the bottom on price, for example, to outsell. It's not like cars, for example, right? Where you want to offer the discount that gets people to buy your car because then they won't buy your competitor's car, right? GPUs do not work like that right now, especially data center GPUs. Every chip that AMD will make will get sold. Every chip NVIDIA will make will get sold. So there is, in essence, no competition between them.
So it sounds to me like you're saying there's not an AI bubble. And I'm just curious, like, why is there so much demand and why is that demand outstripping the supply of GPUs right now?
Yeah, so I think it's for a wide variety of reasons. I think the biggest reason is AI is going to be considered a general purpose technology if it's not already considered so. So when I say general purpose technology, I mean things like the internet, the printing press, the PC, the motor, right? The tractor, things that like transcend one genre of product and are largely useful everywhere, right? So that's the first thing. The reason that works is because AI can be infused everywhere, right? Not just consumer products, but also different enterprise pieces of software, pretty much across the board, right? From genetics and biology to sort of, insert any software category here. You can add an AI agent to help you do that job more productively, faster, cheaper, etc. Right? So I think the demand is there, A, because it's across a lot of different categories, but B, because it turns out that we're going to use way more tokens per prompt than we originally were in 2022. So if you remember earlier this year, A company called DeepSeek from China released a model called R1 and then R2, and these were reasoning models. So now instead of just like asking a question and it generating an answer, the model will actually spend time, which means spending tokens, thinking about its response, double checking its answer, going deeper, breaking things down into step by step, maybe even calling other submodels and things like that. All of that costs tokens to do. So the number of tokens required to serve every prompt has gone up dramatically, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I think is, somewhat confusing in this space is that we call CPUs like general purpose computing.
Yep.
And we call GPUs accelerated computing.
Yes.
And, that kind of seems like it implies that accelerated computing is a more niche workload. It's a more niche use case that like you can only do it for specific things.
Yep.
And that certainly fits with the history of the field. But one of the things that Jensen actually recognized in the early 2010s was he said that, oh, wow, these deep neural networks that we can apply to crazy things like image recognition, it seems like those things are a universal function approximator. So like, what is a universal function approximator, and what's the relationship of that to actually the implication that accelerated computing is, like you said at the beginning, a general purpose technology that's actually maybe not even as large as the general technology of CPUs, but even larger?
Yeah. So let's like break this down into like a couple different questions, right? So a lot of problems cannot be parallelized, right? That's the major difference between accelerated computing and serial computing, which is the CPU, right? CPUs take instructions and process them one at a time serially, right? GPUs can take in instructions, can take in a problem, break it down into chunks, solve those chunks in parallel, recombine the answers, the partial products, and then output an answer, right? That only works for problems that can be chunked up and solved in parallel, right? So like matrix math problems are a great example because you can take each column of a matrix, solve like a vector multiplication problem column by column, then recombine the columns in the right order at the end, and now you've just saved a lot of time depending on how many columns were in that matrix, right? There's a whole class of problems that can't be parallelized like that, right? Maybe not math problems, but certain logic problems, I don't know, like things where the order of the steps certainly matter. So the reason we call CPUs general purpose computing is because they can compute anything. They can compute graphics, they can compute matrices, they can compute, you name it. The question is how fast, right? How much compute power, how long will it take, etc. Accelerated computing can only deal with problems that can be parallelized. Okay, so now let's talk about the second part of your question. If you have a universal function approximator, which is just a fancy way of saying a set of tools that can solve a wide variety of problems, like neural networks, AI in general, neural networks specifically, but there are other like forms of, AI algorithms besides neural networks that are interesting to get into, like image generators don't work by neural networks. Anyway, so, and those universal function approximators can be parallelized. Now you can have your cake and eat it too. You can do anything a CPU can do where before you couldn't, and you can accelerate it because, neural networks, for example, are like the perfect matrix math problem to run on a GPU. That was my research well before ChatGPT came out, was using small neural networks to help accelerate different radars and different telescopes. So just realize AI and neural networks are much older than ChatGPT in general. So Jensen, one of his brilliant aha moments, which has been shared across the scientific community, and he's been actually really involved with like many other companies that use their accelerated computing, is understanding that GPUs are not just for graphics. They're for any problem that can be like parallelized like this, right? Which extends well beyond the initial function of just rendering graphics quickly, which is an important and big matrix multiplication problem. It turns out that AI uses a lot of that same like background math, can be perfectly accelerated, and can solve a wide variety of problems.
And so the reason that I asked that question is because I think the number of problems that can be solved and the size of the computers that are required to solve those problems is tied directly to like how big is the demand for AI overall? Is there an end in sight to this AI bubble, speak that we're talking about now? From what you're seeing, like what types of problems that are big unsolved problems in corporate America, in technology, in healthcare, like are there big problems that really just, AI doesn't help with at all that would lead us to believe that there is, a near-term end in sight to all of this?
So that's an interesting question. I haven't really framed it like that myself. Like, hey, what is a subset of problems that AI just won't solve? But like, let me give you a couple examples, but tell you why that kind of doesn't matter for the purpose of the growth of AI, right? So plumbers, electricians, handymen, carpenters, right? There's this whole class of skilled trade. So these are all very skilled workers that are not about to get replaced by AI, right? Like we will always need plumbers, electricians, carpenters, general contractors, etc. Construction, everything in construction, which is a big part of like humanity's output. I would say commercial driving, we're not really there yet. Obviously companies like Tesla and Waymo are getting much closer on non-commercial driving, like passenger transportation. But I think we're a long way from seeing like autonomous fleets of 18-wheelers on the road. You know what I mean? And then, I'm trying to say there's a whole class of jobs that are high value, high skill, not about to be replaced by AI, right? Those are some examples. But the market for jobs where AI will augment that job, not replace it, not do the job entirely, but augment somebody doing that job, is infinitely bigger. So the world's GDP, I think, is something like $50 trillion, right? You add up all the productivity of all the countries in the world, put together, I think it's about $50 trillion. And you just say 10% of that will get augmented by AI per year. That's a $5 trillion market. I mean, that's bananas, right? Like if you're going after a $5 trillion market, you don't care about the problems you can't solve, because the problems you can solve, that's like, you're chasing that market forever, right? That's more than a human lifetime to build a company that will capture any meaningful percentage of that market. So NVIDIA, I think, does not need to worry about NVIDIA, AMD, all the AI ecosystem doesn't need to worry about the problems they can't solve. There's $5 trillion of problems they can't, right?
Yep. Yeah. Broadcom. Yeah.
Totally. Yes.
Yeah. Samsung. Yeah, so many other companies all kind of tied up in there with that as well. Yeah. Well, here, one of the things I want to do for the audience is I want to put this chart up on screen, which I think shows us a little bit. This is a post from, I don't even know how to say that Kobayashi letter.
I think it's like Kobayashi.
Kobayashi. That sounds more correct, but it says, "This is beyond insane. AI compute demand is now growing," and they say at over 2 times, but they have terrible math. It's actually 3.2 times the rate of Moore's law, which is assuming that Moore's law is still holding up at 2 times every 2 years, which is, I think, not necessarily a good assumption at this point in time. But it says, creating a massive shortage just to meet current demand. There's $500 billion that must be invested in data centers per year until 2030. And then they have this chart here. And so this is a chart of I believe it's basically the sizes of the number of parameters in models that are being trained. Is that
what the dot size is? So the y-axis there is like the total compute required to train it, and the x-axis is just time. So
and I think that the flops required to train it is a function of parameters.
Sure.
And so then, and the second line is just Moore's law, which is the 2 times growth every 2 years. And so it looks like we're creating more intense models to train. 4.5, like every year, the models get 4.5 times more intense to train. And then Moore's law gives you 1.41 times growth in computing power if you were just following Moore's law. But obviously, thanks to Jensen, Huang, and NVIDIA, parallel computing is not necessarily bound by the constraints of Moore's law in the same way. Definitely when you factor in the extreme co-design. So anyways, I wanted to show this as an indication of why, this 4.5 times divided by 1.4 times is like a 3.2 times every year shortfall of Moore's law compared to growth in the size of the models that we want to train, which that compounds over time. So 3 times 1 year, 3 times again the next year, 3 times again the year after that. Like you get into
it's like a 3 times shortfall, a 9 times, a 27 times, an 81 times, right? Like the gap gets pretty big pretty fast, right?
Yeah, and so in 2030s, you're talking about hundreds of times, a shortfall of hundreds of times the amount of demand that you have for training AI compute compared to the returns that you got based on Moore's law. And so, what's your reaction to that when you think about the overall AI market?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's honestly been pretty obvious. The writing on the wall for Moore's law has been there for a long time. Like you just pointed out, Moore's law hasn't been at 2x every 2 years for a long time now. It's closer to 1.4. And just to be clear, that doesn't mean Moore's law is bad. It just means the era where transistor density and the amount of transistors you could pack on a single chip dominated the gains we got in compute is just over, right? That's just not where the gains are coming from. That's, so when Intel says Moore's law is alive and well, that sounds great. And then they don't deliver their chips, right? So, the companies that still believe Moore's law is alive and well tend to have missed the run up and the product, haven't come out with a product to meet the demand for AI scaling laws, right? So that's actually a good transition into what's actually happening now. So Moore's law is one scaling law. It was actually a prediction by Gordon Moore that was hey, transistors seem to tend to double every year. So that's something the industry ended up shooting for, right? Transistors on a single chip every 2 years, excuse me. Today, AI has at least 3 scaling laws, and it really depends how you break up AI and the nuance you want to get into. But there's the scaling as a result of raising parameter counts, right? Just as an example, and getting more training data. So that's scaling with training, right? Bigger models tend to perform better. There's post-training scaling. So that's using reinforcement learning to improve a model's output after it's trained. So that's giving it better guardrails. That's giving it human feedback to refine its outputs. That'd be like putting a satellite dish on a radar, right? It's you're directing all of those tokens a specific way. And as a result, you're getting a much more powerful output in the correct direction, right? So that's post-training scaling. And then as of earlier this year, we have something called test time scaling, which is just a fancy way of saying inference is now able to be scaled with the number of tokens. So instead of one-shot answers where I give you a question, what is the temperature outside? And then you return the temperature outside. I can ask you a deeper question, hey, explain to me why water freezes at 32 degrees. And then you'll sit there and you'll rack your head. You'll think about where to start to give me the basic walkthrough. You'll break the problem down into step by steps. You'll solve each step, and then you'll bring it all back all together to give me a final coherent answer that walked me through maybe physics, maybe temperature, maybe the difference between Fahrenheit and Celsius, maybe what makes water such a special compound or whatever. You know what I mean? There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into that. And that all happens in inference, right? So now it takes more tokens. You can increase the number of tokens you're willing to spend on an answer and get a better output as a result. All 3 of those scaling laws, training, post-training, and inference, multiply together, right? Because a better model that's better tuned and willing to spend more tokens on your prompt to give you a better response is benefiting from all 3 of those scaling laws. So even if they were all only as fast as Moore's law, that'd be 1.4 times 1.4 times 1.4, which I don't know if that gives you the 4.5, but like that's what's happening here is you're multiplying 3 scaling laws.
So now that we've kind of got this framed as, it's not really necessarily an either or between AMD versus NVIDIA, that still begs the question for, someone who's interested in investing in this space. If you have to allocate, how much money do I want to, if I'm putting new, net new dollars into an investment, how do you think about the two different companies when you're deciding on allocating between NVIDIA today? And, like they have enjoyed a lot of growth up to this point. Their multiples are, relatively low compared to the growth that they're seeing.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of growth. I think it was Brad Gerstner on the All In podcast recently showed a little chart where, in 2022 or 2023, both NVIDIA and AMD were making like $23-ish billion a year of annual revenue. And today AMD is making about 33. And of course, NVIDIA, I think like for 200 or something is like 220 or something. Yeah. So it's like basically a 10x in revenue for NVIDIA compared to AMD doing a 1.5 times revenue over, it's 1.5 times over a couple of years. That's not bad under normal conditions for normal markets, but this is anything but normal conditions and anything but a normal market. So like, it seems like there should be potentially more upside for AMD if they really can offer great products in this market segment, since they are behind the curve and maybe they're finally starting to be able to get on the wave. But yeah, like how do you think about these two companies as investments at this point in time? And then, I mean, we can talk about maybe some of these things individually, but like there's ecosystem factors, there's management factors, Lisa versus Jensen. There's the pace of development that these different companies have.
Totally.
Then architectures, you've got AMD's chiplets versus NVIDIA's much larger monolithic designs. So we can let's just start with the high level of how you think about it, and then we can kind of dig into some of those more nitty-gritty elements of the stack.
So you said something interesting that like I want to pick on for a minute, and I'm not picking on you, right? But I do want to pick on this mindset that, okay, one company is performing very well, the other one is not, relatively speaking at least, which means that second company has way more upside. So if I'm not a big sports guy, so if I get this sports analogy wrong, I apologize. Like I make spreadsheets for fun, if you know what I'm saying. But if there's a football team that wins the Super Bowl every year and they're constantly being matched up against the 16th best football team, right? Like bracket of 16, whatever, first versus last seed go together. Why are you betting on seed 16? You know what I mean? Like clearly the guy wearing all the Super Bowl rings is very good at football. He's probably the safe bet here, So like when I hear AMD has increased their revenue by 50% and NVIDIA has increased their revenue by 1,000% and is still climbing, by the way, right? Like they still have earnings calls where they're delivering double or close to triple digit year over year revenue growth, right? Where is the upside for AMD here? Like it's a smaller company, so it has more room to grow to get to NVIDIA's valuation. Like it seems to me that like people who say that, again, not picking on you specifically, but people who say that, that's more of a gut feel than like a real analysis. Small company, lots of upside. Big company, not much more room to grow. But like one thing I want to point out is I've been making videos on NVIDIA for about like 4 years now, right? And if you rewind the clock to where NVIDIA was like $400 billion market cap, right? So just a little bit bigger than AMD is today. I got a lot of flack for saying this company is going to 10x, right? No one could, that's a $4 trillion valuation, right? And the reason I got a lot of flack is for exactly that argument. It's already so big. It's at all-time highs. No way it's getting bigger when there's a competitor 1/10 its size or half its size or whatever. It's going to eat its lunch. Same arguments, right? It turns out that NVIDIA grew from $400 billion to $4.5 trillion faster than AMD 10x, being much smaller or whatever relative to its valuation today, which is still only around, I want to say like $300 or $400 billion, even after this, frankly, comically massive OpenAI deal, right? So I just want to separate current size from future growth, because those two things almost have nothing like to do with each other if you like look back in time, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. And so how much of the assumptions that a lot of investors have about potential future growth really stem from thinking about the market as a fixed pie that someone's getting share out of, versus thinking about the market as something that is potentially, at least for the purposes of the next 5 years, uncapped upside?
Yeah. I think you just hit the nail on the head. Like, that is why NVIDIA and AMD are not competing. And AMD is going to do fine. But again, you just talked about a chart where people expect AMD's revenue to, grow at a moderate pace. And I think that same chart actually had NVIDIA's revenue like capping off, kind of growing steady up until 2027, and then like being relatively flat after that, which makes absolutely no sense to me. But we'll see in a couple years, right? Like, one thing I like doing is whenever I see, and sorry, I'll answer your question in a second. One thing I like doing is whenever an analyst gives like a pretty unintuitive prediction like that, is I like to go back and look at their other predictions and just, are they right? Like, are they good at spotting the trend? For example, Michael Burry really has like a history of predicting things that are unlikely to happen, so to speak, and then they happen, and you're like, okay, there's like Michael Burry, there's something to this guy, at least in the areas of real estate and whatever, right? So, the analysts who think that NVIDIA is going to have flat revenue in 2027 thought that for 2026, 2025, 2024, you know what I mean? Like, they're the same analysts who predict next year is the year that NVIDIA's revenue flattens out, right?
It's almost like the chart that is somewhat famous, at least among the Tesla community, that Tony Seba has, that shows, people's predictions of solar. And, it's clearly on this exponential curve.
I love that.
And then
chart.
every year it's just like, it's going to be flat.
Yeah. This is where it's like, dude, like, you're not even pretending to look at the line you're trying to predict, right? Like, exactly. So
yeah, you're a linear machine in an exponential
world. Fantastic example. Like, when you edit this podcast, please put that chart in, because like, super duper relevant. Great call out, right? Sorry, what was the original question? What are we?
We were talking. Yeah, I think the question was how much of that mindset by investors is due to just thinking that the market is a fixed size and it's all about someone has to get share. Like, this is classic Gary Black thinking, Wall Street thinking, versus like, this market is growing, and anyone who can really produce competitive products, like, will be able to do fine.
Yeah. And it's definitely that second one, right? So like, just imagine you're you and me are in a pie eating contest, and we have one pie between us. And it's like, obviously whoever eats more pie wins. It's that simple, right? Like, whoever can eat you divide the pie into 8 slices. So if I can eat 5, I just win. My only goal is to eat 5, because that means you can't eat more than 3, right? Pizza, whatever, apple pie, pick your favorite pie. If we have that same context, and that pie is growing faster than we can eat it, we're no longer in a contest to eat, like, to just eat pie. We're in a contest just to like eat as much pie as we can, right? Just like whoever fills their belly the most wins, right? That's what's happening in AI. It's not, I'm just trying to eat 5 because that means you can only eat 3. It's, the pie is growing so fast, I need to figure out how to efficiently eat pie, right? It's a silly example, but I'm trying to like come up with a visualization we can all understand regardless of our background, right? You're in a situation where you're not competing with the guy to your left or to your right. You're playing an infinite game. You're only competing with your own pace, because the market is growing much faster than you can churn through it, right? So I think that's all it comes down to, is like that mindset shift of understanding that there is no NVIDIA versus AMD. First of all, they're fundamentally different companies from the ground up. And AMD started as a CPU company. They bought ATI, right? Like, their Radeon line of GPUs is a bought entity. And now it's great. Like, I'm not saying Radeon GPUs are bad. NVIDIA started with and will end with making parallelized computer chips. They've only ever made GPUs. They now make CPUs that support their GPUs in data centers. And I know they're like now co-working with Intel on making CPUs and all that, but like their pet project is CPUs. AMD's pet project is GPUs. You know what I mean? So it's a fundamentally different, like you're comparing apples and oranges from the ground up. So let's dive a little deeper into the AMD versus NVIDIA competition, right? The first thing that people need to really understand is when AMD outperforms NVIDIA, it's for a very specific benchmark. And that doesn't make it bad, it doesn't make it wrong, but they're picking large language models, text to text, meaning text goes in, the model only churns through text-based outputs, and text comes out, right? Answer my basic question, do a text-based search for me, etc. NVIDIA's ecosystem and the way NVIDIA thinks about generative AI in general is not text to text. It's all to all, right? So text to video, video to text, text to rendered code, code to text, right? Like video to video, audio to audio, protein folding, like whatever entity that has a structure, you should be able to input it. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and also, cross modality. So like text to audio, text to video, video to driving controls and
robotic controls. And also like multi in, multi out, right? Like here's a diagram and an explanation. Give me an outputted diagram with another explanation, right? So image and text to image and text, image and text to protein and text, right? So like, et cetera, et cetera. Like they're not optimizing for the same things. And they, again, because they're not competing, they don't have to. And this is where I got a lot of my early NVIDIA versus AMD stuff wrong too, is I'd be like, oh, NVIDIA is just better. You know what I mean? CUDA is just better than ROCm. That's it. We're done talking about it. When you're talking about an infinitely expanding pie, there are some slices that AMD's solution is perfect fit for. You know what I mean? Those are the slices AMD is going to eat. It's Ethernet-based data centers that are ecosystem agnostic, that just want to serve a lot of text-based models very cheaply and roll into their bigger ecosystem. AMD is very, very, very well positioned for that. And that's why they're doing well, right? Like you said, 50% revenue growth over the last couple of years is like, dude, in a vacuum, that's outstanding. It only starts to look bad when you compare them to NVIDIA, right? Like AMD in isolation, those are great returns, man. NVIDIA is, I think, solving a fundamentally different problem. They're chasing all three of these scaling laws I talked about earlier: training, post-training, and inference at the highest level, meaning multimodal models with billions and trillions of parameters dedicated not just to text, but audio, video, rendering code, protein, like multi-modality, large, extremely large context models. And we can get into what all of this jargon means if we care and whatever, right? Yeah.
I want to ask two questions. We'll start with the one on AMD, and then I want to move back to one of NVIDIA's core competencies. So, the one for AMD is the announcement of this big OpenAI deal, which you said was comical compared to like this. Large. Yeah. The size of the deal compared to their current revenues in the segment is massive. So if, a lot of ifs, if OpenAI can deliver, if AMD can deliver, like it's huge. And we assume that, it's not only going to be OpenAI that's going to be customers of the MI450 and,
like totally.
There's a big Meta deal where we know that Meta just announced a 1 gigawatt data center. It's almost 100% guaranteed that at least a big slice of that 1 gigawatt data center is going to be allocated to the MI450. And Oracle obviously is going to be buying quite a few AMD GPUs. So, it does look like there's potentially large growth on the horizon that is much, much faster for NVIDIA, for AMD, especially relative to the size of their current revenues.
Sure.
So how are you thinking about that dynamic right now?
If you asked me 6 months ago if AMD, let's like level up this conversation for 1 second. If you ever told me that a company, any company, would get a deal for 20 times their annual sales, right, of any product, I would be like, that is crazy. And then if you said, oh, but they only have 4 years to deliver it, I'd be like, that's nuts, right? So that's, just to be clear, that's what happened with AMD and OpenAI, right? Delivering a gigawatt of GPUs I think it's a 4 gigawatt deal if I remember right, or it's like
6 gigawatts total over
but 1 gigawatt's
all.
the first milestone, right? Like,
yes, and 1 gigawatt is the first milestone.
yeah, and they have like a sort of like a year-ish to deliver those GPUs. So sorry, just to be clear, the way the deal actually works is OpenAI has to deploy a gigawatt of AMD GPUs to reach their first milestone to get their first piece of equity from AMD, right?
Yes.
That implies AMD can deliver all those GPUs for OpenAI to deploy them in the first place, is why I'm saying it that way, right?
And it implies that OpenAI can spend basically $50 billion in order to deploy that first gigawatt.
But they're at least getting the GPUs like up front, and like, they're getting the money back in equity from AMD and whatever, right? Like, it's not that part of the deal that's interesting right now. Right now, it's like, okay, AMD sells about 200,000 GPUs per year, data center GPUs. I actually did the math in a recent video on my channel. I doubled, like, it's around 200,000 GPUs. So the first performance milestone of this deal implies that AMD will deliver 5 times their annual sales of data center GPUs to OpenAI to deploy, right? It's just like, that's comically large. I'm not saying they can't do it. I'm just saying the deal is much more, it's just so big relative to what they have been doing. It's a huge step function up in their deliveries, right? So, I mean, I don't feel bad for not seeing that coming. I did the math on what that would look like if NVIDIA got a deal for 20 times their annual GPU sales. It's 120 gigawatts of GPUs. That works out to about 70 million GPUs, which works out to roughly all of the compute on Earth in every data center ever put together right now. So it's like, of course I would have never thought, you know what I mean? Like, it's just, it's comically large. Like, it doesn't mean AMD can't do it. I'm not saying AMD can't do it. I'm just saying it's a huge step function for like change relative to what they have been doing.
Well, and it makes you wonder, because I did see a recent announcement from, or a recent excerpt from TSMC that said, yes, demand for AI chips is much larger than even we expected this year. And like just this year.
Yeah. I mean, they just had their earnings and it's like, yeah, it's all AI all the time, right? Like everyone has pivoted all of their like supply for TSMC's chips for like all of their production supply to AI. It's absolutely ridiculous.
And so that brings me back to, one of the things about NVIDIA, as you mentioned, is, they're thinking about solving all of these problems that are really some of the hardest problems at the frontier of the field.
Yeah.
And part of that is the focus that they have as a company on creating new markets. Like, we're going to solve a new problem that's ridiculously hard, that has ridiculously large impact potentially. And once we do, then boom, that's a whole new market that's just going to want, a whole new segment of demand for GPUs. Has AMD ever created a market that did not exist?
I mean, not to my knowledge, and so I won't say that the answer is no, but I think you're keying in on one of the big differences between NVIDIA and AMD. Is NVIDIA is not afraid to bet on a $0 billion market. They're not afraid to say, hey, we'll accelerate this hard protein folding problem because maybe that unlocks a huge market in like gene discovery or drug discovery and medicine and all this kind of stuff that then we'll be the only accelerator for, right? We have this giant library, we have this hardware ecosystem, it sits on top of a giant developer ecosystem. So if we can grow this market from $0
all the researchers who are working on this problem use our...
Absolutely.
So give the audience just a little bit of background on your personal experience with, what is it like to live inside of the CUDA ecosystem as an academic researcher, and, what are the hurdles that other companies like AMD have trying to get you to switch away from CUDA and NVIDIA cards in a research field?
Yeah. I mean, the answer is going to be like a lot simpler than like I think most people think it is, right? It's like once you've built code that works, you're very hesitant to break it, especially if like other people rely on it. And so there's two phases, right?
Can you build code that works on AMD from the beginning, or is that basically 100%, impossible?
100%. No, ROCm is a great ecosystem. Again, Like, let me ask you a quick question, and then I promise I'll answer your question. What kind of phone do you have?
Well, I have an iPhone, so
Why do you have an iPhone?
yeah, it's all of the classic answers, the ecosystem.
Yeah.
I don't need my phone to have the best clock speed or the best camera. I just need my phone to work. In fact, I go about 4 years in between phones, and I don't even know of a Google Pixel that will last you 4 years. So
Yeah. And sorry, again, just to like recap what you said, because you took the words that I was going to say right out of my mouth, is it's not the hardware, right? It's honestly not even just like the iOS software itself. It's the ecosystem. The apps are better. They run right out of the box. You don't have to think. There's almost no customization, which is a good or a bad thing depending on who you are.
It connects to my computer and my iPad and my watch, and
it just works, right? It just like at the end of the day, I click a button and I get what I need done and I move on with my life, right? That's what operating on CUDA is like. Because when I'm trying to do something complicated, the first thing I see is like, did somebody already build a solution to this problem? This hard acceleration problem, right? Like in my case, it was signal processing libraries, that I needed to use with radars, blah, blah, blah. Guess what? Somebody has already accelerated, different kinds of radars and like whatever we're trying to do on CUDA. So the first thing I do is I download all these pre-canned things and I go, okay, how do I need to change this to make it work for me? But I'm not starting from scratch, right? That's what an ecosystem buys you on the front end. It's just the ability to be like, okay, what progress has been already made inside this ecosystem? By the way, app developers for iPhone do the same thing. They're not starting their app from scratch. They're saying, okay, I need this app to tell time. How do other people do that? I need this app to like grab the phone's geolocation. How do other people do that? What's the blah, 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 right? So like the first part of opening any project when you have a large ecosystem is simply what solutions can I already grab to get 50, 60, 70% of the way there, and then innovate, like the 30% I add is the value that I'm trying to create, right? Same thing on YouTube. We both make YouTube videos. I didn't learn how to do this from scratch. What did I do? I turned around and I watched a YouTube video. You know what I mean? I get that mic. Okay, I get that camera. Oh, okay, this is the software. I'm 50% done. Okay, now how do I make my videos? At least I'm not starting from scratch, right? CUDA is like that. So the big thing that people need to understand is that's the front end. And then the back end is switching costs are much higher than like most people will ever like calculate, because there's the cost of switching, which is like selling all your NVIDIA hardware, buying AMD's hardware, transitioning the code. But there is the morale cost of switching. There's the emotional cost of switching, which sounds funny to say, but if you've ever coded something seriously and somebody says, oh, that library that you rely on, it no longer works, you have to start from scratch because now it's only supported by this other completely different language, other completely different whatever. You're like, oh, I'm not maintaining this project anymore. I am done with this project. You take it off of your GitHub and you move on with your life. You're not transitioning it. Like, you know what I mean? Because starting from scratch after solving a problem is too painful.
Especially, yeah, when you have to solve the problem that you solved, except to like if you contributed 40% of the solution before, now you've got to go 70% of the way there. So it's like double the work or more.
Of course. And yeah. I mean, yeah, forget if you work with a big team and a couple key people left and like, the actual dynamics in like a knowledge worker workplace, which is like, I didn't write this code. We wrote this code. I wrote this tiny function. But, when I was working on a radar, it wasn't me, right? It was like a team of 12, 15, 18 engineers. I wrote like the tiny snippets that use AI here and like pipe in signals there. But like a lot of smart PhDs that have come and gone have wrote other code that makes all that stuff work. I'm not rewriting anything they wrote, like if they're already gone, So it's like multiply that problem by every field, by every project, by every company. And that's why AMD is having such a hard time if you're comparing ROCm to CUDA, which we started this whole conversation saying that's not a good way to do it, because there are real markets where ROCm is the answer. It's just those markets are much smaller, much more specific than the general CUDA market. And that's like one of the biggest advantages NVIDIA has is like, there's a reason we all have iPhones. There's a reason, right? It's the same reason most people use CUDA.
Mm-hmm. Well, and yeah, especially within the research, so the use cases that you're talking about where AMD is exceptional and they win tend to be business use cases where someone has like a large workload that they need to run and they have high confidence that specific workload can be optimized to run on AMD software and hardware. Like you don't typically see that at the bleeding edge of research and development for anything commercially or in science.
In research, it's like, oh, we got the prototype to work once. Somebody smarter than us will make it again for mass production, right? Like this is, by the way, something Elon Musk is incredible at. Is he's really good at like taking a prototype and saying, okay, how do we make a version of this that can be mass produced, right? And that is an unbelievably powerful and unbelievably rare skill. But that's the difference. Is like academia cares about solving a problem, even if it's a little janky, right? Like you want to optimize it, especially if that's like the heart of the research. Like a lot of the papers I worked on and stuff like that were about making a janky process less janky. Like that's just the best way of putting it, right? But eventually it's like the next level of non-jankiness is actually production ready code. That's not what we do here. Kick that to a giant company. They'll build the real thing that makes it to the market, not us. You know what I mean? We build the first one, they build the 10 millionth one, right?
But it does create a lot of momentum when you're talking about generating these new markets, and the markets come out of research and development. And it's like all of the mind share of all the people working on the project really is all locked inside of CUDA, just because it is so easy for them to, like, everybody that they're working with is also developing on CUDA. And so, it's like whatever those, I think that's one of the things that for investors, training, it is that linear thing. Training is NVIDIA's market. Like NVIDIA has training market on lockdown. And so they're going to continue to have, whatever high 90% share of training, but training's not going to grow. And there's not going to be any new markets that are going to invented that GPUs are excellent at and that CUDA is excellent for. And so therefore, that's why you see the chart bend over and they're going to go into flat revenue growth.
And also
mode.
Training and inference will never be one market, right? Like that's also implied in that chart, right?
Totally. And like I would just say that fundamentally misunderstands NVIDIA's entire company philosophy. Like Jensen is a student of Clayton Christensen in disruptive innovation, and he knows, like, if you were to tell him today that NVIDIA 5 years from now will primarily be a training compute company, he's like, oh, well then NVIDIA's dead. Like we will have been disrupted.
Sure. For sure.
And so like if we don't create new markets between now and then, if we don't drive incremental new demand for computing by solving incredibly hard problems, which, if you listen to the GTC conferences, he's already talking about what those next things are going to be. It's going to be robotics. It's going to be stuff in healthcare, like drug discovery and material science and all sorts of different things, fusion, potentially. Then he would assume that NVIDIA will have gone bankrupt if they don't succeed at creating those new markets. And then when you hear Lisa and AMD, they're talking about, hey, like we just want to try and capture share in, inference, which is going to be big and growing, mostly. And like we would like for our computers, hopefully, to be at least a viable option for some training.
Yeah. It's there's a really great TED Talk. It's like, gotta be like 15 years old now, but it's like, if you've ever seen the TED Talk by Simon Sinek, he's had like a couple really good ones, but the one I'm talking about, I think, is called The Infinite Game. So like he was talking about how Steve Jobs is playing the infinite game, where it's like, he's trying to create the best product for the most people, right? The iPhone, the iPad, like I think then it was just the iPhone, right? And Microsoft at the time with their Microsoft phone, whatever,
I think
whatever
it was the Zune.
Called, no, the Zune,
it was the iPod versus the Zune.
Right. Yeah, you're right. So, and like, Steve Jobs only cared about one thing, making the best iPod. Everyone on the Zune team cared about what the next iPod was, so they knew how to like incrementally improve on that, right? The Microsoft team was looking left and right, and Steve Jobs was only looking straight ahead. I think that's the difference between NVIDIA and AMD today. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with either of those paradigms, right? Like if you're going to treat it as a competition, you should know what your competitors are doing. But there's a reason that I think NVIDIA wins, and it's because they're not afraid to invest in those $0 billion markets to capture them when they're $100 billion markets, right? Knowing that not every market will get there, but like the drug discovery and protein folding is not something people thought 5 years ago would be done with generative AI. And now the only way to do it with generative AI, broadly speaking, 95% market share or whatever, is with CUDA, right? So I think that's the smart way to play this game. And it's the only way you can play when the pie is growing much faster than you can eat it. Is like you need to look at the horizon and be like, I need to fundamentally change my pie eating strategy because there's something unique and special about this moment in time, right? I can't look at what the other guy is eating. I have to just focus on grabbing the most pie I can while it's growing, you know?
Agreed. I'm going to pin you down here at the end of the episode on like, if you had $1,000 today, you know, what percentage are you allocating to AMD? What percentage are you allocating to NVIDIA? But before we get to that question, I did want to maybe address a pattern matching thing that I see among investors that,
Sure.
You know, I think people say, okay, Lisa Su, turn around AMD, incredible.
Totally.
She basically was able to kill Intel, and Intel was the biggest company in computing. And so therefore, because Lisa Su was able to kill Intel, there's a good chance, and it may be a chance worth taking, that she can kill NVIDIA and Jensen Huang. And I would caution investors, if that is the underlying logic behind your investment thesis, that Jensen Huang is founder, CEO of NVIDIA, and he is still running NVIDIA as a founder-led company. When Lisa Su finally killed Intel, and I mean, they are basically dead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, government bailouts.
Yeah.
You've hit the bottom.
Yes. When that happened, they were not a founder-led company. They were trapped at like the far ends of the innovator's dilemma. And what I just talked about earlier with Jensen, like the strategy of creating new markets and exploiting them, that is Jensen's solution to escaping the innovator's dilemma problem. And Intel was like at the very tail end of being a dead and dying dinosaur when, and so was AMD. That was the reason that Lisa Su was able to turn around AMD is because they were also that. And so like she managed to get them to escape from the innovator's dilemma trap at a time when Intel could not escape the innovator's dilemma trap. And so like that's how the structure of Lisa Su's ability to, you know, gain quite a bit of market share against Intel in this much more fixed pie world of CPU computing, which is not growing anywhere at the level that GPU computing is. And so anyways, I wouldn't generalize her ability to be able to disrupt Intel to then being able to disrupt NVIDIA.
And just to be clear, like Intel put itself in a position to be disrupted. Like Intel was the king. Intel does two very incredibly difficult things. It started failing at one of them. So both AMD and Intel design chips, but Intel also builds their chips where AMD does not, correct? So what happened
anymore? They used to. Sold right before she took over, I think, or maybe I think that was before her tenure that they had sold to Global Foundries.
Yeah.
And gone directly with TSMC.
Yeah. So that, I mean, also a brilliant move, but like really the start of Intel's downfall was when they didn't invest in like the latest EUV technology. This is like more than a decade ago now. And they started losing big clients like Apple. Like Intel used to make all the chips in Apple's MacBooks, I want to say. And like, I want to say in some of their iPhones, I like can't remember now because it's like been a while since that happened. But like then they just like couldn't deliver the chips on time and Apple went somewhere else. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's not AMD killed Intel. It's Intel killed Intel and AMD filled the vacuum. So then if you frame it that way, it's like, will NVIDIA make a critical, fatal mistake the same way that Intel did? That's the real question you're asking, because AMD did not kill Intel. They just filled the void that Intel left. And greatly so, by the way. Like they make great data center CPUs. Nobody's arguing that. I don't see Jensen making any fatal mistake. Like, of course, there's going to be missteps, bad investments, libraries that don't pay off, chips that don't get sold, blah, 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 blah. Like no one's saying NVIDIA is flawless and won't make any mistakes. But making a fatal mistake where AMD can jump in, I would bet money, and probably to answer your next question or the question you asked previously, how much money would I bet? even just going just by their market share today, and adjusting for their growth or whatever, I would put $900 in NVIDIA and maybe $100 in AMD. You know what I mean? Because of what I just said, I do not see like NVIDIA's risk management, when technical risk management is so good and they're so diversified compared to what we spent this whole video talking about, which is AMD is really only after one slice of the pie. And if they don't win it, that's it, right? Like that's why their growth has only been, low double digits year after year. Their data center revenue is still not bigger than their gaming revenue, right? Whereas NVIDIA's, I want to say like 88% of their revenue comes from data centers. And then, so it's like, which company is more exposed to AI? The company that makes 88% of their money from AI, or the company that makes like 30 or 40% of their money from AI, So.
Yeah. And I mean, if they do inflect upwards in that growth towards AI, obviously it could be a great time to be on the wave for AMD. But yeah, when you think about one of the things that I learned from a guy named Dave Lee, who's, really a big Tesla investor.
Yeah.
Was, the size of the ambition of the company that you're invested in really matters. And when you see, Jensen's ambition for what it is that he's trying to create, it's obviously much larger than the ambition that AMD is really chasing. And so, if he can execute on his vision, like if you said that both Jensen and Lisa executed extremely well on their vision for what the future can be, one of those futures is a much larger future than the other one.
Yeah. You could also take the downside of that, like the same question, but just flip it. If both of them miss their vision by 50%, which company would you bet on? Jensen all day, right? It's like if Lisa Su misses her vision by 50%, that's flat growth, right? If Jensen misses by 50%, he's got a $10 trillion company. You know what I mean? So like if he's wrong by, I actually did the math in another one of my videos. It's like, let's just cut all, like, we don't trust Jensen, right? It was actually my reaction to the BG2 pod where he was on. It's like, okay, he's saying all these big numbers. Just first thing we do is we cut him in half because we don't trust him. Oh, the market's still so insanely large. Yeah. You know what I mean? So it's like when you play those games, just cut the number in half. Would you still bet on it? So that's how I think about these things. Well, like, when the market gets so big, you can't really imagine, like, what is a $10 trillion market? I don't know how to imagine that. So it's like, okay, scale it down and try to like picture it in units of Microsoft, in units, like things like that. And then it's like, okay, what is, like, go from there,
Yeah.
So,
well, I think that might be a great place to wrap up here. This was an awesome show. Thanks for coming on with me today and helping us get brighter. Yeah, there's a lot of complicated issues and questions, and you did a great job of explaining the reasoning behind it. And I really thoroughly enjoyed this. So hopefully the audience does as well. Obviously they can find you on YouTube at ~U. We've got links down in the description for that. Is there anywhere else that you'd like to direct viewers?
Nope. I'm primarily on YouTube. I do a little bit on X. Like I kind of copy and paste stuff over there too, but definitely, if you're interested in learning about AI and the chips that power it, check out my channel.
Awesome. All right. Well, have a great day, and we will catch everyone on the flip side.